I'm Brandi Kruse. Happy Friday. Welcome to Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. Undivided is presented by our founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. You can visit them at 1530mortgage.com. It is the end of primary election week, and so I thought it was fitting that we spend a lot of the show today on election-related issues. And so we're going to shelve Fridays with Friends and Florida Report just for this Friday because we've got a lot to get to. You guys know how much I kind of preach and care about not default voting and trying to get away from the two-party system, just voting for people based on R or a D. I just don't think it's very healthy. I think sometimes it can rule out the most qualified candidate. Well, in Washington State, the Secretary of State's race is pretty interesting. There is a Democrat who's moving forward to the general election, but there's also, it appears, a nonpartisan candidate who is going to move forward to the general election because Republicans ran like 4 people and split the vote. And so Julie Anderson, who is currently the person in charge of elections in Pierce County, Washington, she's going to join me today to talk about her run as a nonpartisan and the attacks that she's expecting from Democrats. Also today, we mentioned that there wasn't really a red wave on Tuesday as Republicans had hoped for. I mean, I'm not even sure. I think the title of my Wednesday subscriber show was Not Even a Red Ripple. So the chair of the Washington State Republican Party is going to join us today to talk about what went wrong and also how they need to adjust their messaging, particularly on the issue of abortion, if they hope to do better in November. So we'll hear from Caleb Heimlich. But first, I want to have a conversation about how to run a good campaign. I know there are going to be differences of opinion on that, and certainly it varies race by race. But what we're seeing in Washington's 8th congressional district, I think, is a reminder that voters want to know what you stand for. And voters want to know what your ideas are. As I've said repeatedly, I believe the 8th district here in Washington is one of the most important swing seats in the entire country. It's why we did a 90-minute special report on it, sitting down with the incumbent Democrat Kim Schreier and also what we believed were the top 2 Republican challengers, Republican Reagan Dunn and Republican Jesse Jensen. Well, an odd scenario happened. It's one we had thought there was a slight possibility for, and a man named Matt Larkin looks to be moving forward to the November general election. Now, how do we account for this? You had 2 Republicans who were getting all the media attention, who were getting all the big endorsements, who the mainstream Republicans seemed to be behind. And yet you have Matt Larkin, who, I mean, like I said, we did a 90-minute special, and I don't even know if we mentioned him. We did invite him to do an interview and didn't hear back from his campaign. But, you know, when that happened, I thought, well, he's probably not going to win anyway. And so why don't we just focus on the 2 candidates who are coming in? So how do we account for this, what happened with Matt Larkin? Well, in the final weeks of the campaign, the 2 leading Republican candidates got into the mud with one another. I think it started with a PAC flyer about Reagan Dunn's history with alcohol abuse, and it just escalated from there. There were attack ads and mailers, some bordering on the absolute ridiculous, like this one comparing Jesse Jensen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Why is Jesse Jensen lying about Reagan Dunn? Because Jensen's hiding that he called socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a fantastic role model.
So while his 2 Republican challengers were mud wrestling, what was Matt Larkin doing? Well, Matt Larkin was focusing on the issues.
Inflation is reaching record levels. We can't afford to fill up our cars with gas. We can't afford groceries.
I got this mailer from Matt Larkin's campaign at our house. I thought it was the most ingenious mailer that I'd seen the entire election cycle. Very simple. Make crime illegal again. I mean, that's a statement that we can all get behind, regardless of political party. Very simple. Make crime illegal again. And in his campaign ads, Matt Larkin wasn't attacking his fellow Republicans. He was focusing on his background, his record, and his ideas.
Matt Larkin is an owner of his 3rd-generation family business right here in Washington, creating hundreds of good-paying jobs. Matt knows how to get this economy back on track.
So you can attack your opponents all you want, but spending time pointing out how bad they are is not exactly a ringing endorsement of your ability to do the job. All right, as I mentioned earlier, I spoke with the chair of the Washington State Republican Party. And I'll play that interview for you in a moment. I should note that we taped it on Thursday, and so you might have some slight adjustments in where the races stand today. On Friday, there's a couple that are pretty close that we're keeping an eye on. But Caleb Heimlich was pretty honest. The fact that the Tuesday primary did not turn out as they expected. I think there had been this sort of a feeling that there was momentum on the part of Republicans because of the state of the economy, the low approval ratings of President Joe Biden. And so we talked about that and sort of what went wrong, and also how they're going to change their messaging or hone in their messaging on issues that matter most, like the issue of abortion. It became pretty clear on Tuesday that voters did prioritize that, at least in Washington State, as an issue when they filled out their ballots. So here's my conversation with Washington State Republican Party Chair Caleb Heimlich. Caleb, I appreciate you being here. There was a lot of excitement, I think, for Republicans building toward the primary. How do you think things went?
Well, I think anybody that thought it was going to be easy in Washington State was being naive. And so I think we have our work cut out for us for the next 98 days, but there are certainly some good opportunities in front of us. And in particular, I think the 42nd legislative district up in Whatcom County, that's 2 House seats that we don't currently hold, where the Republican vote share is 51% plus. So I think that's a positive sign. But there's some other legislative districts, kind of the 26th in the Senate, the 47th, that I think we were hoping to pick up. And I think we still can, but we've got work to do to kind of close the gap and make sure we're winning voters over there. The 8th congressional district is obviously going to be super competitive. Kim Schreier's below 50%. It looks like Matt Larkin's going to come through there. We'll see ultimately over the next couple of days with all the ballots getting counted. But big picture, I think, again, in Washington State, we've got our work cut out for us, and I think we're up to the challenge.
Just because you were kind of listing off races there, the U.S. Senate race, the state party had been really excited about Tiffany Smiley. You guys endorsed her early, which is very unusual. You usually let things play out in the primary first. How do you feel about her performance?
So I think as a first-time candidate, obviously she's moving on to November. So that's kind of the first hurdle to clear. Patty Murray in the low 50s. I think she's dropped from above 54 to below 54. Hoping to see that trend continue a little bit. Lines up to be a relatively competitive race. I think we've always known it's going to be tough. The fact that Senator Murray and her campaign spent $4 or $5 million really going after Tiffany in June, I think impacted some of this primary results. We're now seeing the NRSC, the Senatorial Committee, is running an ad talking about Patty Murray's support for President Biden. And I think President Biden remains unpopular in Washington State. So I think that's going to help move some numbers. And I think the more that Tiffany tells her story, gets her message out there, that will help compete with the swing voters that we really need to kind of move over and make that race even more competitive. So obviously not the best results, but I do think there's still a path there.
And the 4th congressional district and the 3rd congressional district, it was sort of a national focus. We had 2 Republican incumbents with pro-Trump challengers. It seems like the incumbents are going to be able to move forward to the general election. Do you think that's the best outcome for the party?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've got to count all the votes to see what happens. I think there's a lot of votes to count in the 3rd. And so with the drops, it'll be interesting to see if anything changes there. Ultimately, our position at the state has been, since the committee didn't endorse, we didn't get involved in those races, we're focused on holding those seats in November. And I think we're in a strong position to do that in both the 3rd and the 4th.
So the state party didn't and doesn't have a preference as to whether the incumbents move forward or their pro-Trump challengers move forward.
Yeah, we did not take any action in those 2 races.
Either way, that dynamic exists in those districts. And regardless of when, the votes are official, whether the incumbents or the pro-Trump challengers move forward, you have a clear rift there. In those districts, in those parties. How do you repair that to give those candidates a chance in the general election?
I think at the end of the day, Republican voters are looking at the future of our country, looking at what's at stake. I think Republican voters all agree we don't want Speaker Pelosi. We want some balance back in Washington, D.C. We want to check on President Biden's agenda. And the House is within reach. We need 4 seats to flip the House. And I think that is the most likely scenario. Most national observers are saying that the Senate is a more difficult path. So the House is kind of Republicans' best hope of providing some balance in Washington, D.C. And I think the last thing we want is to lose 2 seats or either of those seats to someone whose first vote would be for Speaker Pelosi, referring to the Democrat candidates. So I think that is the message to Republican voters, regardless of who gets through, and a part of the kind of the motivation to hold the party together in the 3rd and the 4th district.
So just generally speaking, a lot of polls leading up to this primary about what issues would drive voters. I was of the belief that inflation would be at the top of the list and the economy, just because the everyday impact. Do you think Republicans and the Republican Party underestimated how much abortion would factor in Washington state?
Well, I think for any analysis, it's important to keep in mind at this point, we're looking at 25% turnout. So 25% of the voters have chosen to participate in the middle of summer. It is only a month and a half, 2 months after the Dobbs decision. So this electorate will be a different electorate in 96 days and the November election. So it obviously we need to do more analysis. We'll be doing some exit polling. We'll be talking to voters and understanding what's driving them. As we've knocked on doors, over 200,000 doors in the different targeted legislative districts, overwhelmingly what we're hearing from swing voters is inflation and public safety concerns as the top 2 voters. I do think, particularly for Democratic voters, abortion has been a big motivator and may have caused their turnout to be higher than it otherwise would have been. So that certainly could be factoring into the results and what we're seeing in August. But if Democrats got voters who were going to vote in November anyway, if those voters voted in August because they were extra amped because of the Dobbs decision, that ultimately won't tip the scales much in November if they were going to vote anyway, if that makes any sense. So a lot of what we have to determine by talking to voters, by listening to them, by understanding what's motivating them, what's driving them, is kind of who turned out in August and then who's going to turn out in November. I think in November, we're expecting 70 to 75% turnout. So that's 3 times as many people as we've heard from so far in the August primary.
Well, I mean, if Democrats are motivated, Republicans need to be extra motivated in a state like Washington. I look at Kim Schreier, the congresswoman from the 8th, the Democrat. She did better in this primary, about the same, but better in this primary percentage-wise than she did in 2020. And by most accounts, 2022 should have been a much easier, a much harder primary for her with an unpopular president, midterm, and just the state of the economy. And the district was supposed to be better as well after redistricting. So how do you account for that?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors is she spent a significant sum of money in 2022, and she did not spend any money at all in the 2020 primary. So, I mean, the fact that she was up running an ad claiming to be standing up to the Biden administration or taking on, I forget the exact phrase, taking on the Biden administration, shows that she was taking this race seriously. And so I think as we're going to see a significant campaign over the next 96 days to talk about her actual voting record, what she has done, what she said herself when it comes to knowing that the votes were going to contribute to inflation, as she said on a town hall, and she's on record saying, I understand this is going to help contribute to inflation, and voting for it anyway. And pictures of her walking hand in hand with President Biden in Seward Park in Seattle. So I think there's still a lot of campaigning to be done and messaging to voters on what her record has been in 4 years as a member of Congress and what our candidate would do going forward. So I'm not fatalistic about those results in the least. I think given the fact that she spent a lot of money, was up on TV, was campaigning pretty aggressively in the mail and is still below 50%, shows that there's a path to electing a Republican in the 8th.
Yeah, you want to be above 50% as an incumbent, certainly. But, the conventional wisdom was that either Reagan Dunn or Jesse Jensen would emerge to the general election. Matt Larkin is certainly, if that's how it ends up at the end of the day, he was sort of the sleeper scenario. Reagan Dunn and Jesse Jensen, I mean, they got into the mud in the final weeks. They had some pretty nasty attacks against each other. Do you think that that contributed to Matt Larkin possibly winning?
I do. I think as I talk to a lot of voters, even Republican primary voters, they're turned off by the negativity. And so, I mean, in my chronology of things, it appeared that super PACs backing Jesse went after Reagan first, and Reagan responded. And so I think ultimately, as voters saw that, we're getting bombarded with that, whether it was on email, whether it was text messages, whether it was in their mailbox, whether it was on TV or digital ads, they were looking for who's the candidate that's going to make the case on what they're going to do. And Matt Larkin did a good job the last 3 weeks of making that pitch, of giving that campaign. I'm a voter in the 8th. I think I received 4 or 5 mail pieces from Matt Larkin talking about his record as a businessman, as a job creator, talking about his pitch that he's going to make crime illegal again. And so I think that his campaign worked. And I think he built a lot of momentum, really picked up steam in those last 3 weeks as voters were looking to say, who do I want to vote for? And they ultimately, if the trend holds, decided to vote for him because he gave them that reason.
Quickly on Jesse Jensen and Reagan Dunn in the mud, did you, as the state party chair, reach out to their campaigns and tell them to stop it?
I did talk with them. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's as you know, some of this was outside their control with independent expenditures and rules about coordination and everything else. But yeah, I mean, I was on the phone with all of them talking about them. You and I have been talking about this for 4 or 5 years about civility in politics, and I think that's. I think this is going to be a case study of saying, hey, there's a benefit to making a pitch the right way.
On that note, I know we're kind of running short on time. Making a pitch the right way. If it's Matt Larkin who goes through, he's more conservative. He is certainly more conservative on the issue of abortion. What do you think is the best way to talk to voters about abortion without being dishonest, but the best messaging strategy for Republicans on abortion leading up to November?
Well, particularly at the state level, I mean, I think I would draw a dichotomy between the state and the federal, but I think at the state level, the focus is Republicans have always respected the will of the voters, and Democrats, frankly, in this state have not. You can talk about $30 car tabs, the initiative. You can talk about the carbon tax when voters voted it down, and then the very next session, Democrats implemented a very similar version of that. And so Republicans have always maintained we respect the voters and we respect what they wish. And so right now in Washington state, we've had 2 citizen initiatives codifying when abortion will be legal and when it's not. And so for our candidates for the state legislature, I think that has got to be part of the conversation of, if I'm elected, here's what I will do and here's what I won't do. At the federal level, I think you can make the case that as a constitutional conservative, which I think Matt Larkin is, obviously you'd have to ask him what his position is and what his campaign will be. So I don't want to speak for him in particular, but I think in general, you can make the case that what the Dobbs decision did was put that decision back to the states. And you would respect that as a member of Congress and allow the states to decide what their policies will be and what those policies won't be.
But he's on record as saying that he would not rule out voting in favor of a national ban on abortion in Congress.
So I haven't seen that. I'll have to go back and look at the debates and then look at what he said. And I'll have to obviously talk to him to see what he says. Obviously, there have been pro-life representatives in the 8th congressional district before, whether that was, I believe, Jennifer Dunn was pro-choice, but I think Dave Reichert campaigned as being pro-life. Obviously, it's a different environment now than maybe 6 years ago. But so that's ultimately going to be up to the candidate to define what their position will be, what their position won't be.
Let's end this, Caleb. One thing that you think Republicans need to do different between now and November.
Well, I think that the biggest thing, we've got to make sure we're connecting with our voters and listening to voters. I think we've been doing that in the primary, and I think we'll continue to do that. But it's really, I think we as the party and any of our candidates, you can't take anything for granted. And I think, unfortunately, with the idea of a red wave, with the idea of momentum, it's easy to think this sort of thing is just going to happen. History, it may be a precedence, but it's not a guarantee of what's going to happen in the future. So even though this is a midterm election, even though President Biden is deeply unpopular in Washington state, and frankly, even though a lot of our constituents, a lot of voters are struggling with the Biden economy, struggling with 9.1% inflation, struggling with expensive gas prices, struggling to afford rent and groceries and everything else, we've got to connect with voters, we've got to listen to voters, and we've got to make the case that we care about them and we will act on that concern. I think there is Washington state definitely leans blue. And so there's a perception of what the Republican Party is, what the Republican Party stands for. And we have to make the case that maybe in some cases we're and our candidates are different than what maybe they think or what maybe they've heard. So it all comes back to, you got to show up, you got to listen, and you got to make the pitch on what you're going to do to better the lives of the people you're seeking to represent.
Yep, effective, honest messaging. And I hope you can also reach out to those voters, and I've heard from them, who say they don't vote because they don't think their ballot will count. I just don't think that that's going to be productive. And so I don't know how big of a segment of the Republican voting base that is, but I don't know that you guys can afford to have any voters sitting out in November. So Caleb Heimlich, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Brandi.
There is a race happening in Washington state right now that I believe is a test of our ability to break free from the habit of default voting. And default voting is, of course, when you say, I don't know who this candidate is, but I'm going to vote for them because they have an R or a D next to their name. Julie Anderson, who we sat down with at length on Undivided when she launched her campaign for Secretary of State, is running as a nonpartisan. This position is open right now because our former Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, who was a Republican, left to join the Biden administration. Now, this was sort of a sticky situation because Republicans had been the Secretary of State, the person who leads our elections. They had been in that position for like 60 years. And when Kim Wyman left, Governor Jay Inslee installed a Democrat in that position, Democratic State Senator Steve Hobbs. Well, Steve Hobbs has no elections experience. He is a political appointee in a position that, frankly, he's not qualified for. So Julie Anderson, who's the auditor in Pierce County, so she's been running Pierce County elections for about a decade. She decided she was going to run as a nonpartisan, but she knew that it would be an uphill battle, particularly if Republicans coalesced around a single candidate, and then it would kind of squeeze her out of the general election. However, that's not what happened. Republicans inexplicably ran 4 candidates who split about 38% of the vote amongst themselves, sending Julie Anderson, it looks like, forward to the general election and to what I believe will be a test of the ability of voters to look past political party. Julie, thanks for joining us on the podcast. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great.
I spoke with Caleb Heimlich, the chair of the Washington State Republican Party, yesterday, and he seems a little annoyed that Republicans ran so many candidates. Do you tend to agree that you wouldn't be in the position to advance had Republicans not done that blunder?
Oh, I definitely needed luck to succeed in this campaign. My message is strong, I'm strong, but running as a nonpartisan candidate is unheard of in a state office, especially an executive office. So I needed some disruption in the field, and I was counting on, because it's an open seat, people filing against each other. So that was all in my favor, and I don't think I'd advance to the general if so many Republicans hadn't been competitive and filed.
Yeah. I tend to believe that you, if you do advance, which it looks like you're going to, will be the next Secretary of State. If you're just looking at a Democrat versus getting all the Republican votes, and I know there are a lot of Democrats who support you as well. Do you think that my belief on that is accurate?
Oh, I definitely believe I'm the next Secretary of State. I'm going to be working really hard to make sure that that's true. I'm not sure that all the Republican votes are going to break my way. The incumbent has a history that he likes to promote a lot about uh, um, his appeal to the Republican Party and his Republican partners. So I don't think I'm going to capture all the Republican votes. I do want to point out, though, that primary voters are distinctly different than general election voters. One of the reasons I'm so confident and happy this morning or today is primary voters are very reflexive, and they tend to be the most partisan and party loyal, and also just the most regular voters, right? And for that many people to set aside their party preferences and to place their trust in me and vote for me bodes well for the general, when it's a much wider audience. And an audience of people who aren't married to a political party. So we're going to have more of unaffiliated voters casting ballots in that general election. So I think that's where my edge is, not necessarily capturing all of the Republican voters.
Well, we'll get to kind of your message to Republican voters and Democratic voters, for that matter, to round out today's interview. But just as an elections official, can I get your thoughts on 25% voter turnout in a primary like this?
If you graph it, as we do, we're seeing a very normal cadence. We're always disappointed, but we're never surprised. Local elections and midterm elections and primaries particularly, it's hard to generate energy. And we're suffering from, a very typical post-presidential hangover where people are exhausted. And that's one of the reasons why the primary has low turnout and only diehard partisans are participating.
So I told you before we recorded, and in full disclosure, I'm writing an op-ed about this race because I am vehemently opposed to default voting. It's something that I've talked about a lot, really trying to encourage people to look past the little letter next to someone's name. Does it bother you at all, and be honest, that someone who has never done an election before got 41% of the vote, and you've spent your life on elections and you got 13% of the vote because you don't have a D next to your name?
Bothered isn't the right word, because it was so predictable. I mean, I definitely knew what I was walking into, and people are behaving in very normal ways. The only thing that's different about this campaign is that I'm offering myself. Voters have never been offered a choice of experience plus no party strings attached. So that's the only change. So I'm not surprised at the 41%. Obviously, the incumbent disappoints me, and I don't think he's prepared, and he needs to get out of the way because he's not the right person for Secretary of State. But I'm not surprised that a party affiliation is carrying him into the general election, and no hard feelings there either. One of the misunderstandings about my campaign that I'm going to have to work hard to overcome is I'm not trying to undermine the political parties, and I'm not trying to start a third party. I just don't believe that the political parties belong in this office, given the responsibilities. So,
when it comes to you and Steve Hobbs, like you said, and it's undeniable, he doesn't have experience for the job. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but so your strategy going into the general election seems obvious, but have you and your campaign thought about what his strategy might be in terms of trying to elevate himself against you?
I only know what I've observed him doing so far, which is capitalizing on he's been in the office for 8 months, sitting on candidate forums and editorial boards with him. He's been there for 8 months. He's doing the job. He's getting things done. Those seem to be his talking points. And he's just continues to really lean into the cybersecurity aspect, which is just it's an important, but a very small percentage of what needs to be done. So I would expect more of the same, but I don't know. I don't want to get in his head or live inside his campaign, because it's not going to change my message and my approach. So since I'm not going to be shifting much, it doesn't do me much good to get inside of his head. So,
do you anticipate attack ads, though, of any kind?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
But like on what? On what, I would wonder.
Oh, well, you can't have 13 years of experience without having some content for somebody to attack. I expect the Democratic Party to attack me because of voter turnout, holding me responsible for low voter turnout. I expect both sides to attack me for she's a Republican. She's really a Democrat. And we're going to play this spy versus spy thing. People are going to dump money into trying to figure out who I am and that I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing. I expect because I have experience and have testified in front of the legislature on election policy in the past, they're going to attack some of that testimony. When I was the president of the Association of County Auditors and also the legislative chair of that group, I represented the consensus view of 39 professionals, and sometimes we were critical about laws that were being proposed in the legislature and wanted to fix them or didn't want to see them advance as written. And they'll attack me as being undemocratic, unsupportive of the election laws that we have, and things like that. So that's what I'm expecting.
Well, obviously you have your expectations. And have you ever seen, a random question, but the movie 8 Mile about Eminem's life?
No.
Oh, come on, Julie. So he's in this rap battle, right?
Okay.
And he decides that he's going first. And so he's going to rap about all the things that are wrong with him. And so then when his opponent goes, his opponent doesn't have anything to say because he's already said it all. So you just listed what you know that your opponents are probably going to go after you about. So let's just tick some of those things off quick. When it comes to voter turnout in Pierce County, which has been lower than some areas, how do you explain that?
Well, it's an ongoing problem. For 40 years, Pierce County has been performing at below the state average. So this is a long-term problem. And I think that all of your viewers who follow the economy know that people chase affordability, and Pierce County has always been that affordable place that people flee to. And so we've got lots of turnover. The net migration in Pierce County is like 9,000 people a year. And in a vote by mail or any election environment, actually, the more churn you have in the population, the harder it is to get people engaged with their community, focused, because typically that's a time of change and crisis. What divorce and moving are some of the most stressful things you can do. So we've got that high turnover. We're also home to the fourth largest military base in the country. That is an awful lot of people, and some of them do register to be Pierce County voters, but 40% of that population exfills, and then 40% comes in on an annual basis. That's another lot of churn. We did some estimates that if our active military voters actually voted at the same rate as the general population, we'd be adding a whole percentage onto our voter turnout. And don't forget, when you do rankings, somebody's first and somebody's last. That doesn't mean that it's a substantial difference. If you look at the counties that are just clustered that have between like 0.5% to 2% difference between each other, there's a lot grouped together there. And I'm not sure how informative that is about election performance. And as you said, we've eliminated just about every barrier that we can in Washington state. And I've gone the extra mile, way above what laws tell me to do to try and close that gap. And I'll run on that record of effort and not take responsibility for the public health and social stress that the residents of Pierce County are under. That is a different problem, and it's one that worries me as a citizen and a neighbor. And it's something that the parties should be worried about, quite frankly, because they hold the keys to a lot of those solutions, whether it's infant mortality and morbidity, whether it's the fact that Pierce County residents don't live as long as the rest of the state. All sorts of public health indicators and economic indicators show that our county is under stress. And voter turnout's just a canary in the coal mine. So I wish they'd get busy focusing on the underlying problems and just have a little bit more compassion and be more realistic.
So what is just one thing that you've done to try to increase voter turnout that is under your control?
Sure. So one of the things we do in Pierce County, we know that voters, 1% of the electorate they're going to wait to take action on election day, which means they're scrambling around figuring out, am I registered? Am I not? Did I change my address? Where's my ballot? Those people would be left behind that would be just enough of a barrier that they wouldn't participate. So Pierce County contracts with all 3 of our library districts, where on election day, we have 27 library branches that become extensions of our office, where voters can register to vote, get issued a ballot, vote, and drop it off all in one place. That saves our voters in Pierce County an average of 14 miles on election day. And it also, for some of our population that is, one, they don't intuitively think of Pierce County Auditor as the place to go for elections, or they don't have a friendly relationship with county courthouses. Going to a library is a lot friendlier, but it's also a lot more convenient. So that's just one example of something that we've done to help close gaps.
So the second thing you mentioned that you think your opponents will go after you about is trying to pin you on one side or another, saying, oh, she's not nonpartisan. She's just pretending to be nonpartisan.
Yeah.
So if Democrats do that, because the party in this state, they tend to paint everyone as like an extremist. I mean, they think that if they can say, oh, there's the Trump supporter or whatever it is, that it'll help them. So if the Democratic Party tries to say, oh, well, she's just too far to the right, she's not a Democrat, what is your retort to that?
Look at my record of performance. Ask me specific questions. I will be staying focused on Washingtonians and what they need, be driven by data, looking for efficiencies and increases to security. I'm not sure what's partisan about that. Those are all very objective things to pursue. And I would just ask voters who belong to either party to please ask me specific questions and to visit my website, by the way. I hate to say it, but a lot of my positions and thoughts are already posted on my website, unlike my opponent that has nothing really specific or any plans. So
what is your pitch going to be to Republicans, who I still hear from so many people who are just distrustful of the office? They don't trust elections. They don't like our mail-in voting system. Some of them aren't even voting as a result. So how are you going to appeal to Republican voters between now and November?
Well, I'm not going to be able to appeal to all of them who really want to extract a promise of rolling back a vote by mail and some other unpractical and unpopular and ineffective things. I'm not ever going to appeal to them. The first thing that I would say is, in a contentious election, who do you want calling balls and strikes at home plate? Do you want somebody that's wearing a team jersey, or do you want somebody that's not affiliated with a political party? And I have found that to be very convincing. The other thing that I can say is that my approach is not to belittle and disrespect and mischaracterize people that have concerns. So if they want a respectful listener, even if I'm not able to deliver on things that they want, would they rather see that? And collaboration. I want to bring everybody together to talk about the next evolution of elections in Washington State and where we go from here. But we're not going to be rolling back vote by mail. We're not going to be rolling back online voter registration. We're going to be adhering to federal and state laws that are already in place, and then doing some fine tuning. The security and transparency piece is something that I've got specific action plans that have been appealing to conservative voters, or actually just regular everyday people that have been listening to the news and are concerned about security. I'm proposing a statewide risk limiting audit, which is a great improvement over what we're currently doing, which is random batch audits at the county level.
Okay.
It's more statistically significant and rigorous, and it answers that question that everybody seems to have, which is, why did these top of ticket people lose so badly when their party compatriots down the ballot are successful? That is evidence that there must be something corrupt. A statewide risk limiting audit answers that.
Gotcha. So you're open to hearing from voters who have concerns, and your office will be responsive to concerns that people bring forth that are reasonable concerns?
Well, of course. Of course. What we have to do, though, is we always have to weigh, because not a lot, but some of what I hear is it's possible to cheat. Not that there's any evidence of cheating, but it's possible. And to what lengths will we go to prevent the possibility is something that you've got to weigh. It's got to be a practical solution that doesn't have an offsetting result of shutting people out of the process or making elections so complex and expensive that we can't conduct them in a reasonable manner. But I'm all ears. There are things that I would like to do to make reforms in the Department of Licensing, for example, regarding the enhanced driver's licensing and that citizenship check that happens. Those are reforms that are good for lots of reasons, not just elections. And I want to be talking with our legislative partners about that. For example, a good start would be just eliminating the fee for an enhanced driver's license. I work in customer service, something my opponent doesn't do, and am constantly at the counter issuing passports, vehicle licensing, et cetera. And people will do anything to avoid a fee, not to mention a surcharge that's basically 3 times the expense of a basic driver's license. So people are applying for a driver's license. Remember all of the people moving and all of the people coming into our state, they're applying for driver's licenses, and chances are they're bringing a certified birth certificate with them, but it's not being recorded simply because they're not going to apply for an enhanced driver's license to avoid the fee. It doesn't mean the documentation isn't being brought forward. It's not being collected just because of a revenue issue. That's a little silly to me.
Yeah, and you and I chatted in, I think it was December when we sat down, about this opportunities for fraud issue. And I had seen it firsthand. I had a family member who got ballots for like 5 elections who wasn't eligible to vote in our state. And so I think people wonder, and that's it's not fraud unless I filled it out, which I didn't. But I think when it comes to people who continue to be getting ballots who shouldn't be ballots, what can you do about that as Secretary of State to try to limit opportunities for fraud in that manner?
Maybe closer connections with the agencies that are issuing visas, because I don't know that story in detail, but I imagine that the resident that you were talking about is an authorized resident, probably on a visa status, which means they've had screening through Homeland Security. They're working with the federal government. They're known to the state. And working with those agencies to make sure that those residents understand what registration means and that they're placing their legal status in jeopardy by simply filling out or saying yes to that voter registration form. Another reform I'd like to do at the Department of Licensing, because I think that's where a lot of the leakage is making sure that we're offering that registration question in the residents' primary language, and also making sure that they are actually having to read and affirmatively check a box rather than the clerk checking a box, affirming that they want to register to vote, and making sure that if English isn't their primary language, that oath and affidavit, the decision that they're making, is translated. Because most of the time when I hear those examples, it's a foreign exchange student that's here on a visa. Maybe they're getting their graduate degree or they're doing a residency somewhere. And when they're at the Department of Licensing getting a driver's license, which we want them to do and they need to do, they're being presented with that question in a way that either they're overlooking, they're not hearing, or they're not understanding. Those are fixable problems.
Yeah, and what happened with my family members, they moved out of state and then continued to get a ballot here, even though they had a driver's license in a different state?
That I am hoping that story is from more than 3 years ago.
Yes.
Okay, there have been a lot of improvements and enhancements since 3 years ago. Washington State has moved to a centralized election management system called VoteWa, and we've greatly reduced that kind of data error. And we now have one unified voter registration system, and those the issuance of unexpected ballots has been greatly reduced. So I'm glad to hear that was an old example, and things like that should be happening less and less in Washington State.
Yeah, don't get ballots for them anymore. One more question on
Well,
an issue.
and
Oh, go ahead.
I just got to say, public service message. If your household is receiving a ballot for a household member, a renter, or who knows, and it's coming to your house and they don't live there, all of you have to do is say return to sender, no forward address, and put it back in the mail stream. People think that these are like specialized documents that they should not do anything with or shred, but in fact, just send it back. And what immediately happens was we put that voter on an inactive status. And one, you won't get ballots anymore. And two, they won't be, they'll be in an inactive status until they contact us.
Great. Okay. It's good to tip, and that's easy to do. One quick issues related thing. Where do you stand on felon voting?
Well, I was really happy with the Senate bill that passed in the last legislative session. Auditors as an association supported that, and that provided clarity and a clean break where there was no longer any consideration for legal financial obligations, and it was very clear. Are you having breakfast behind bars, or are you having cereal with your kids at the kitchen table? You can't vote if you're behind bars. If you're in an apartment, you can. That kind of crisp clarity is what election administrators like, and it's easier to explain to voters. So I support it.
And what would you say to other voters who do not want felons voting?
Well, I would talk a little bit and ask a little bit about why, and explore for them just for the sake of listening, and having some empathy, because they may be a crime victim or a law enforcement officer or a court officer. I just want to hear a little bit more about when does forgiveness begin. So I'd listen a little bit, and then I would also talk about the way we selectively use language about voting. Sometimes it's a right, sometimes it's a privilege, sometimes it's a responsibility, but it's really a mix of all three. And if we want people that have a felony history to begin repaying society after they've finished their time in confinement, why wouldn't we want part of that reconciliation, if you will, to start with voting? You and I started off the conversation talking about how low turnout was. Oh. And in those circumstances, we probably talk about voting being a duty and a responsibility. Why wouldn't you want everybody grabbing an oar and doing their part?
All right, Julie Anderson, well, I appreciate the conversation. I'm sure we'll chat again before November. Let's just end with this. I think it's fascinating, and I've told you this, I mean, to see what happens here with someone running outside the two-party system. Moving forward, since there isn't a Republican in the race, do you anticipate to get some sort of more mainstream support, like from the Republican Party? Is that something that you want?
Sure, but to be clear, I am not soliciting or accepting any party endorsements, so they'd be kind of wasting their time endorsing me. But individual voters, absolutely. And what I hear from people is that they really want their party to succeed. You know, that sane middle. They really want their parties to succeed. And so they didn't want to abandon some of the reasonable candidates that were in this election. And there were some reasonable candidates. I didn't agree with their positions necessarily. I certainly didn't think they were prepared for the office, but they were reasonable people and they didn't want to abandon their party. Now that they haven't come through, they're going to be looking for another reasonable person. And what I definitely hear from those voters is they want somebody with experience, and they want somebody that's going to be politically neutral and driven by data and have good communication skills.
All right, Julie Anderson. Well, we will watch and see where your campaign goes, but very interesting to say the least.
Yeah, we're making history.
I appreciate Julie Anderson joining us on the Undivided podcast, and I look forward to watching this race eagerly to see if it is possible for someone without a party affiliation to be elected to statewide office in a state like Washington that is so blue when it comes to who we put in statewide positions. All right, no Fridays with Friends today, no Florida report. Gave my sister the Friday off because we had so much election stuff to talk to. But I do want to end with our segment, Understanding America, because there was a good passage. I always find that I can find a passage from American history that seems to represent current day, and has some reflections and some ties. So Understanding America every week, and the show on Friday, where I read a passage from an important text or speech in American history to give us a better understanding of this wonderful country of ours. So the speech that I have chosen today is a very famous one. It was delivered by founding father Patrick Henry in 1775. You know what it is? It's give me liberty or give me death. And what the speech was for is he was trying to convince Virginia to send troops to fight in the Revolutionary War. The reason I wanted to read a passage from this is I was pretty surprised and disappointed this week by the level of apathy in the Tuesday primary. Only about 25% of registered voters sent their ballots in. And I know I'm soaking in politics, but I just don't understand that with so many things going on. Every single person is touched in some way, particularly by the economic issues, the cost of gas, public safety. And I just thought, gosh, this is your chance where you get to actually say how you feel about how leaders are doing their jobs. And so 25%, it just seems apathetic. And I wondered, I think there are people who they just shut themselves off from all that stuff that's going on. And, if they're not being impacted by crime, they kind of don't want to worry about it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. And it reminded me of a portion from Patrick Henry's speech, because I had read this a couple times before. And so I want to read this passage to you. It is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number who those who having eyes see not, and having ears hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Those are the words of Patrick Henry in Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death in 1775. Sometimes it can be hard to sit and think and dwell on all the things that are happening right now that are bad. And I, as a former TV news person and someone who does a political podcast, I understand that. I do. I get it. But we have to, in order to improve those things, we have to be honest about the problems. We have to see the problems for what they are. And we have to throw all of our passion and desire to fix those problems into it, head on. And that is the only way that we're going to solve them. And a part of that is voting. All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the Undivided podcast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment, as always, to giving common sense a comeback. Undivided is presented by our founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. You can visit them at 1530mortgage.com. And don't forget, if you like the podcast, if you listen to the podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber. You get a bonus episode every single Wednesday. So that's 4 to 5 bonus episodes a month for $5. I think that's a pretty good deal. You can do that in 2 ways, patreon.com/undivided, or by becoming a contributor on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com.